one of the serious issues that we in the media have to deal with. And I want to start this conversation today because I'm still trying to figure out for the media outlet that I run exactly how we ought to cover issues like Anthony Bourdain suicide. There is something called the Werther effect. Okay, the Werther effect is a very well-studied phenomenon. It's essentially copycat suicide. When a person who is very prominent commits suicide, there are a lot of people who begin thinking a lot more about suicide, fixating a lot more on suicide, thinking of it as a glorious out. I remember after Robin Williams' death, the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences put out a tweet of the genie, right? Because Robin Williams played the genie, saying, "You're free now, genie." Okay, that sort of glorification of suicide is awful and actually promotes suicide, obviously. The Werther effect is named after a book called The Sorrows of Young Werther by Goethe. That book, supposedly, I mean, the studies are conflicting, caused suicides all over the continent. There were young men who saw it as such a romantic ideal to commit suicide, they actually started walking around wearing the clothes that Werther is described as wearing in the book. But whether it was true of the Goethe book or not, it has been confirmed over and over and over. In the aftermath, for example, of Marilyn Monroe's suicide, in the months after her death, there were 303 excess suicides, meaning higher than average, in the United States. There have been multiple studies on this sort of stuff. After that show by Netflix, 13 Reasons Why, which essentially glorified suicide and said there were excuses for it, that a normal person who didn't suffer from depression or problems could be bullied into suicide. Once that show came out, Google queries about suicide, this is according to The Atlantic, rose by almost 20% in 19 days after the show came out, representing between 900,000 and 1.5 million more searches than usual regarding the subject. 17 out of the top 20 searches were significantly elevated. The biggest increases came with terms related to suicidal thoughts and ideation, like how to kill yourself. And many European countries actually have laws on the books that prevent the media from reporting about suicide, specifically to avoid this. In Venice, they had a spate of people throwing themselves on the train tracks, and I believe that they actually changed the law so that people could not report on that, and the rates of suicide by throwing yourself on a train track went down. Now, I'm not calling for abridgment of the First Amendment or laws on this basis, but in the same way that I've suggested that my media outlet will no longer report the names or faces of mass shooters, I'm seriously considering changing the rules here at the Daily Wire when it comes to coverage of celebrity suicide or suicide in general. There is something that I want to talk about in just one second called the Papageno effect. This is the counter argument. The media should actually cover all of this stuff. So the Papageno effect basically suggests that if the media covers this stuff in a positive way, if the media covers suicide in an attempt to dissuade you from committing it, that this lowers the rate of suicide. That really only applies when you are telling a story about somebody who's considering suicide and then didn't do it. So if you're covering somebody's actual suicide, it's very difficult to avoid people having dark thoughts about doing the same thing. The Papageno effect is named after Mozart's Magic Flute character because Papageno is a character in the opera who's considering suicide, and then he's talked out of it by essentially three young boys who are sprites or spirits. And that effect has not been all that well documented. It's a pretty recent study. I believe in Australia they've done some studies on the Papageno effect. But the idea there is that the way to help make suicide less palatable to people is to show them stories of people who would have committed suicide but then did not go ahead and actually do it. In covering celebrity suicide, we may in fact be doing a serious disservice, and I'm admitting that that's what we're doing right now, and that's why I'm reconsidering, I'm considering right now actively what we should do as media outlets with regard to coverage of suicide. So there are a lot of issues to unpack here, but I think that we all tend to go surface level when it comes to the problem of suicide in America. We tend to think on the right that you can just bully your way through depression, which I don't think is generally true. We tend to think on the left that if we just cut out bullying and if we're just nicer to each other, then suicide goes away. I don't think that's true either. I think that we have a crisis of meaning in our society that is happening right now where young people don't know why they are living. What is the point of their life? Why exactly is it important for them to remain alive as opposed to killing themselves? And if we don't fill that gap with something, then that gap will be filled with nothingness. And that's a very scary thing. We need to come to grips with that. We need to come to grips with the fact that happiness in life cannot be linked to your material well-being. It has to be linked with a purpose. It has to be linked with something that matters. Right? People who believe that they are living for something that matters are far less likely to commit suicide, which is why you see that there's less of a suicide rate among people who are involved in communal activities, not just because there's a community there, but because they feel like they are pushing towards something greater. If we don't recapture that, if we become this atomized society where we're all individuals and we sadly tweet R.I.P. Anthony Bourdain when we see a suicide, I don't think that this crisis is going to get any better any quicker. I think that we have become a solipsistic society that is very inwardly focused, and that has some pretty negative ramifications, some pretty negative side effects. We need to start being other focused, and that doesn't just mean for those of us who are not clinically depressed reaching out to people who are clinically depressed. It means that people who are on the verge of depression is, I've lived with people with depression. Okay, depression is extraordinarily difficult to deal with, not just by the person who's dealing with it, but by everybody living with that person. If you've ever been in a house with somebody with depression, then what you can feel it. It legitimately feels like there is a dark presence in the house with you. And I think one of the great lies that's told about depression is that depression is about lack of self-esteem. Depression is about complete focus on self. I've dealt with many depressed people, severely depressed people. I've people I'm close to who have been suicidal. From the outside, what it looks like is somebody who is so self-obsessed because they're tearing themselves down that they can't get out of it. And the cure to that is to get out of your own head. The cure to that, whether that requires a boost from some sort of drug, that's quite possible. But the cure for that is to live beyond oneself. And as a society, if we start living beyond ourselves, we're going to be a lot better off in terms of suicide than we will if we continue to go down this path of Instagram selfies and materialism and the idea that happiness can be bought with the price of $1, or that happiness consists in essentially libertinism, that happiness consists in doing whatever you want whenever you want to do it, as opposed to living for a higher purpose. Happiness consists in living for a higher purpose. Without purpose, we are all here for no reason. And that's, I think, what the West is falling into. I think the West has fallen into a crisis of meaning that it's having a very difficult time pulling out of. That does have some political ramifications, and more importantly, it has some very serious spiritual ramifications as well. So, I feel terrible mostly for Anthony Bourdain's family. It's just a horrifying story. Same thing is true for Kate Spade. Again, if today you are having problems with depression, please go check out the National Suicide Hotline Prevention Line. Please go check that out, like right now. Don't wait, because your life does matter. Your life does matter. The number, again, is 1-800-273-8255, 800-273-8255. Okay.
Our daughter ended her life at 24 due to depression. If someone is determined to end their life, how can one change their mind? Oh, well, first of all, I'm very sorry about that. That's a terrible thing. Look, I had this friend. Sorry. There's been a lot of depression in our family, so it's a question that cuts close to the bone. Anyways, I had this friend, a friend of my parents, and her granddaughter committed suicide, She was just beating herself up about that. What could have I done? What could have I done differently? This is the problem with suicide. It leaves everybody behind thinking, oh my God, what could have I done? I could have treated the person better. I could have listened. I could have been there. It's like, and she was just beating herself up about this, really feeling that she wasn't a useful person, that she'd failed as a grandmother. She's a really good person, And so I went for a walk with her, and I said, and she's married, and she likes her husband, and he's a really good guy. And I said, look, you're blaming yourself for your granddaughter's suicide. It's like, are you blaming your husband? Are you sitting him down and telling him what a useless bastard he was as a grandfather because his granddaughter committed suicide and how he failed completely? She said, no, I'd never do that. So I said, well, don't do it to yourself. No. Depression is a terrible thing. And many, many, many things cause it. And we don't understand. We understand some of them, but lots of them we don't understand at all. Sometimes people get depressed because they're really sick. We know that depression can be an inflammatory disease. It might be associated with autoimmune dysfunction. There's lots of reasons that people get depressed, and depressed people can go places that are so dark you just cannot imagine it. And it isn't necessarily the case that you can always rescue someone, but drowning yourself in the aftermath of a suicide is not helpful. So there's a good room for self-forgiveness there, maybe you did some things you shouldn't have done that were reprehensible and all of that, but you don't want to beat yourself up. Remember the presumption of innocence, right? Innocent until proven guilty. And you have to apply that to yourself. I think there are times when people are so depressed that there isn't anything that anyone can do. And the depressed person thinks, and this is probably the worst part of it, The depressed person thinks, everywhere I look, it's nothing but catastrophe. And I can't see any way out of it. I can't see any path forward whatsoever. And then they think as well, and maybe it's the combination of these two thoughts that really make people suicidal. It's like, it's hopeless. It isn't going to get any better. No matter where I turn, there's no escape. The suffering is unbearable. And I'm absolutely no use whatsoever to anyone. It would be better for everyone if I was just gone, because if I'm not so much of a burden now that it's going to destroy their life, then I'm going to be that much of a burden in the future. And so it's hard to imagine what that's like for people, but it's dreadful. And there's lots of ways you get there. And so you can listen to people. You can desperately encourage them to seek the help they need. You know, like I've seen antidepressants work miracles on very, very many people. Now, they don't work for everyone, and they're not a panacea, but, you know, they have side effects and all of that. But one of the side effects of untreated depression is that you kill yourself, and there is no recovery from that. And the probability is actually rather high. So you can go to war with them about antidepressants. If the person can't get out of their depression and they're suicidal, it's like, what do they have to lose? 1 month on antidepressants. They'll know. Well, they might have to experiment longer, because it would depend on, you know, some people respond better to some classes of antidepressants than the others. It's worth having a war with someone if they're in dire straits and they won't do everything they can to get better. ECT works, electroconvulsive therapy works for intractable depression. It's a terrible thing to contemplate, but the modern versions of ECT aren't. One flew over the cuckoo's nest. And again, it's like there's no coming back from death. So, look, it isn't clear. You can't rescue everyone. People get sick and they die. And sometimes the way they die looks like it's depression. Depression is a multifaceted phenomenon. You can be there for them. You can listen. You can watch. You can intervene. You can try to understand. You can hold them accountable. You can do all of those things. But everyone has their own destiny, you know, and you're not omnipotent. And so sometimes a catastrophe occurs, like your daughter's. And then you should try to drag the least amount of misery forward that you can once you recover from your grief.